What is wrong? All right, we're live. Okay, I'm like clicking all the buttons. Thank you for whoever gave a thumbs up, or maybe that was just my system on this end. Happy pre-Friday. Welcome. My name is Nike Olabisi-Green, and I'm the creator and chief movement leader at NOLA Movement. At NOLA Movement, we believe that when women are well from the inside out, we can change the world. And I am on a big mission to do that. And I serve that mission by creating high energy spaces for women to find wellness. So I do that through coaching, through workshops, retreats, and conversations like the one I want to have tonight. So if you joined me last night, I had a guest. A couple weeks ago, I had a guest. Sometimes I'll do the Ignite at Night solo. Sometimes I'll have guests. But this evening, I wanted to revisit the book that we read this summer at our Ignite Ladies book club called Believing, Our 30-Year Journey to End Gender Violence. This book is by Anita Hill, and it was so timely then, and it continues to be timely now. So I'm going to get my notes up. If you are with me live, let me know that you can hear me. Drop in the chat, let me know where you're from. And if you watch the replay, I really want to start by letting every single person that's watching this replay know, especially if you're a woman, especially if you're in Cleveland, that your stories are true. We believe you, we hear you, we see you, and specifically, we at NOLA Movement, we stand with you. So I want to begin our conversation there. So this summer, we read the book Believing by Anita Hill, and it was so powerful. I want to summarize some of it for you all. So I also want to begin with some of the rules that I begin with when we are live in the book clubs in Cleveland. So just a couple things. This is a space where we respect and listen with our heads and with our hearts. This is a space where we don't place the burden of understanding on those who have the lived experience of what it feels like to be part of a historically marginalized group. This includes, but is not limited to, Black folks, brown folks, queer, LGBTQ folks, and folks that might be or have experienced gender violence. This is a space of empowerment. We learn the facts, listen to options, and we step into our lives with clarity to create lives that we love living. And so I want to begin with that. That's usually how I begin when we're in person. And I wanted to return to that tonight specifically for this conversation. So I have to be honest with you guys. This book was a tough read for me. It was tough because I think we had first read What Happened to You, which was also tough, but it was talking about mental health. And it was, for me, that one was really encouraging, right? This book was just a reminder of how real this issue is and how present it is specifically in the city of Cleveland. I got a lot of messages from women who were having a challenging time reading this book. And this was probably, not probably for sure, this was one of the smallest gatherings that we had in person for the book club. So it made for a really intimate and beautiful conversation, but definitely it was one that was harder for folks to come out to. So let's talk about gender violence and what we mean when we talk about gender violence. Gender violence is any violence, aggression, or harassment that occurs as a result of one, not conforming to expected, traditional, or modeled gender roles. This can include verbal, physical, sexual, psychological, or socioeconomic. So I think it's really important to begin here with a definition of gender violence, because I think when we think about it, or at least I think before I read this book and allowed myself to explore this conversation, we think of it being toward women. But what this book opens up for us is that gender violence is not just about violence toward women. It is about violence toward anyone that is not practicing a conformed gender role, right? So that really expands the conversation that we get to have when it comes to gender violence, because I think in that regard, it is impacting so much of our culture right now, so much of what I even want to get into as we continue this conversation. So in the book, Anita Hill not only recounts her experience with gender violence at the hands of Justice Clarence Thomas, but she gives a startling picture of what it's like in America right now. She recounts, and the headlines that we all know, right? She recounts those headlines, comments made by our former president, I'll call him number 45, and then by folks on college campuses, by Indigenous Native American women. There are so many stories of gender violence. We are reminded that it is very real and that it, along with racism and climate change, must be recognized as a national crisis. She reminds us that it is systemic and that it survives because we all operate in full systems, in a culture full of systems and processes that allow the same unfortunate result. Right? It's not by accident that these things keep happening, that these situations keep happening, that these stories keep happening, and we keep having the same result. Y'all, that is a system, right? And I'm a visual person. As you get to know me, you'll know I'll always throw out visuals and the way that my mind processes things. But when I think about a system, I've had the opportunity to work in a manufacturing space. I literally think of like a manufacturing system and the processes that a widget or something has to go through to be created, right? And a system makes sure that every single widget comes out the same, right? There is internal processes and audits, quality assurance, all these things that ensure that that widget on the end of that system comes out the same. So I invite you to step into that visualization with me when you think about, when we think about gender violence and why the result, when we think about Deshaun Watson, when we think about the Me Too movement, where we got to the end and we were able to see all of these stories and they were the same. That is because we're in a culture that is full of systems that ensure that the outcome is the same, right? So in the book, Anita also pulls out the importance of intersectionality, and she points out that there's greater risk among Black women, among Native American women, and folks that are a part of the LGBTQ community. She reminds us that our solutions must be radical, survivor focused, and a community effort. And it starts with our leaders. So let's get into this conversation. If you are live, if you're coming in, my name is Nike Olabisi-Green. I'm the creator and chief movement leader at NOLA Movement. And we're having a conversation about Anita Hill's book and specifically the theme of gender violence. And so really, because I'm flying solo tonight, I'm just sharing some of my thoughts. I'm sharing some of the things that as a coach that I offer to women who work with me. And then really, if this podcast, if this YouTube comes across someone who has been impacted by gender violence, who has been impacted by someone like Deshaun Watson, I want to make sure you know that you have at least one person in your corner who is standing with you, who believes you, who sees your light, who wants you to know that you're loved and supported. When I get to the end, I'm going to share some resources, but if nothing else, I want you to know that. So as it relates to this book, y'all, I read this book and the Anita Hill, when Anita Hill had to go and testify, that was a time where I was very young. And so I actually didn't recall it. And so I listened to a podcast and I'll drop the name of it in the YouTube show notes because I don't have it in my notes here. But it really took you through interviews, conversations with her, the journalists that were talking about it. Really brought out so many good points. And it was really amazing to me to listen to because it was the same time that I was recalling what Christine Blasey Ford was going through. And they parallel the two of them in the two of their situations in this podcast, both having experienced sexual assault from men who were preparing to step on the bench as Supreme Court justices. And as I listened to the parallels and Anita recount her sexual assault and then Christine recount her sexual assault, I was just like so saddened. And even as I think about it, because I was listening to this podcast while I was walking, oftentimes I would listen while I was walking, and I would just slow down and stop or have to push replay, because how is it that I think 25 years apart, maybe almost 30 years, that again, we don't believe our victims, right? We don't believe our survivors. And the attack that was mounted against both of these women was parallel. It was the same. And so it was really disheartening for me to, and I think that's why this book was such a tough read, right? Because it's so real, it's so right in front of our faces. So it was disheartening to read and to see those parallels. And I go back to what I started our conversation with, right? It is a system. Our culture is full of these systems. And if I have to name the systems, let's get into it, right? Capitalism, patriarchy, racism, all of these systems that ensure when women come forward, when folks come forward, when men come forward, when a person comes forward with a story of gender violence or sexual assault, that it's not believed, right? So it blew my mind to think that Justice Thomas and then Kavanaugh are both sitting on our Supreme Court bench. So that was like one of those moments this summer where I really had to catch my breath as I was reading through this book. At the book club this summer, we also talked about the impacts of gender violence on our youth and how it really begins showing up in bullying those who don't conform to gender norms. So I think this is so interesting, especially now in our culture as all of these book bans are happening, right? So if you go across the country, there was a great segment on the Daily, the New York Times podcast, just the other day about books that are being banned in our schools. It's happening across the country. It's happening really intensely in Ohio. Honesty for Ohio Education is an organization that, if you're not familiar with what's happening, connect with them. It's happening in Ohio, also across the country. But the majority of the books that are being banned, so many of them that are being banned, are stories of young people, young folks, fictional essays that are exploring their sexuality, that are exploring and stepping out of gender norms, right? So again, when we talk about this is a system, it starts from the cradle, right? It starts from, and let's go there. It starts from the cradle. It starts from gender norms. If you are having a girl or a boy, you design the room in pink or you design the room in blue, or if you're having a gender reveal party, you have, the confetti come in the air that's pink or blue. So really, when we think about how we get to a place where on the end of the system, all of the stories are the same, it is because at the cradle, in schools, we are ensuring that folks conform to gender norms. So we talked about this at the club. We had a great speaker. She's the creator of Love Doesn't Shove. I will share her information here, but that's an organization in Cleveland that does the work of going into schools and talking about bullying and talking about really how do young people build healthy relationships with one another? How do you have a loving, caring relationship at a young age that begins to model healthy relationships, right? Healthy boundaries, which was something that we talked about last night. So, gender violence in the form of domestic violence is another thing that we talked about. One of our leaders on the panel this summer was from the YWCA, and we talked about that gender violence in the form of domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness in women. right? So are you starting to see and understand why gender violence is such a big deal? How it really does touch so many more of the areas. It's not just about rape, right? It's not just about sexual assault, right? It is a part of our culture in so many ways we don't even recognize. It is this system. It is this system. So it's the leading cause of homelessness in women. Our panelists spoke about the YWCA and the services that they offer. And then we talked about how the behavior continues to be reinforced by cultural norms and continues in high school and then in college in dating violence. And so, again, just thinking about the system, how from childhood to then high school and college to then dating violence and then relationship and domestic violence, and how that has the potential to lead to homelessness for women. So it was really important for me as someone who has lived in Cleveland to really think about and talk about the impact of Deshaun Watson joining the Cleveland Browns, joining the NFL, and coming to a city like Cleveland specifically, and how we continue to give a pass, right? We continue to give a pass to men, and I'll even say specifically Black men who are able to throw a ball, dribble a ball, sing, dance, right? We're able to look another way as a culture or as a society when we value the system, capitalism, right? If I could just put that in here, when we value the thing that they offer. And the truth is, the thing that these men oftentimes offer is money, and money for the city, money for the club, money for the team, right? I think we could also even point to a candidate like Herschel Walker, who just this week was defeated in Georgia. Thank you, God, right? But how was a candidate like that able to rise to such prominence and to the position where he almost made it into our Senate? How? It is a system, right? It is a system. It is a system. And so it was really important for me to bring this conversation up and to just share it with you all as some nuggets to think about. And hopefully, this conversation is getting your wheels turning as you think about gender violence, as you think about how it may be showing up around you, as you think about how you may be standing guard, right? So in what ways are you enabling it? In what ways are you supporting it that you might not have thought about or fully thought through? So, one of the quotes that Anita Hill gives in her book on page 80 is that it is entrenched in our institutions and protected by our processes. She's talking about gender violence, right? And I want to say that again. It is entrenched in our institutions and protected by our processes. And so that is why we continue to see the same result happen. And that is why I think this is maybe the third or fourth week now that Deshaun Watson is able to go about his life, bought $1 million home in Cleveland, is making millions of dollars when tens and tens and tens of accusations have been made against him in this area. Right. So connecting the dots specifically in Cleveland, it was really disheartening for me because, and these are, again, there's so much I will share with you all in the notes for this one because there's so much here. But I want you to understand the scope of Cleveland. So in 2020, right as we were stepping into the pandemic, Bloomberg City Lab released a list of the best and worst metros for livability for Black women, and Cleveland ranked at the bottom. So if you didn't know that, I want you to take a look at this article. It's probably a 10-minute read, if that. But this article is not that old. And it ranked Cleveland in the areas, and all these other metros in the areas of health outcomes, education outcomes, and economic outcomes. And so again, when we think about why is it important to have this conversation? Why is it important to protect Cleveland's women and specifically Cleveland's Black women? I start with Black women because when you protect those that are the most marginalized, everyone else will be surely protected, right? So it's important for us to start here to understand Black women in Cleveland, like the livability there is literally been ranked the worst among several metros. In addition, the group Enlightened Solutions produced a report called Project Noir. I will also link that here if you're not familiar with it. Take a read. This project and this project rather, I don't want to call it an essay, but this report did a deep dive. So they recognize like, okay, this article is not going deep enough. Let's understand what's really happening. And they had nearly 1,000 accounts of women out of Cleveland sharing stories of isolation, frustration, marginalization, discrimination, and abuse. And they looked and shared these stories specifically in the areas of the workplace, in healthcare. So that means when they're going to the doctors, their doctors are not believing them. When we're in our workplaces, recognizing that we're working harder, we're not being paid as much, our voices are not valued in the same way. And then also in the areas of health, education, so health, education, and in the workplace. So this report did an even further deep dive and really got the stories from women. And so we know both from a quantitative and qualitative perspective how Black women are feeling in the city of Cleveland. So to address that, the mayor, our amazing mayor, Mayor Bibb, he's created a commission for Black women and girls to create opportunities to improve the quality of life for Black women in Cleveland. Awesome. Great, right? So we have all these things happening in the span of 2 years. And then also a player like Deshaun Watson coming into the city. And so I bring all of those up because I think you can see the contradiction, right? So it's like on one hand, okay, this is the worst city of livability for Black women. And then on the other hand, you have the city saying, okay, we're going to do something about it. But then in this other space, our sports and entertainment and our corporate spaces, we have all this money still being thrown at a team and toward players that disregard all of that experience. And so I think that is where we get to have really meaningful conversation around if we truly want to make the city better, who's going to talk about this, right? How are we creating the space to even have the conversation of all of these contradicting things that are happening in whole in our city? So I just want to continue to share my thoughts. Again, as I sat and thought about this, it was just really disheartening. It was really disheartening, especially as I listened to different podcasts and watched different interviews with this player. And there has really been very little remorse shown. There's been very little accountability. And we see this modeled in, again, President 45, right? That president who was able to say a whole number of things and no accountability was called for. And so that is modeled. And again, we see the same result happening where folks are given a pass, men are given a pass, people who are able to check the box of I'm fulfilling this role for capitalism or for the politics or the culture of the time, they are given a pass. So it reminds me that all of these passes that we keep giving, and I've said this already, it's so deeply rooted, y'all. It's so deeply rooted in capitalism, in patriarchy, and white supremacy, and racism. And it really is until we as a culture, we as individuals, on a community level, begin to examine how am I standing guard at the door to protect capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, right? What are the actions that I am doing in this system that enable it to continue? And what are the baby steps that I can begin to take to undo that? Like, if you care, right? If you care, if in 2020, the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and you've had these moments in the past 2 years of revelation, if any of that mattered and you're serious about stepping into the work, right, what I'm inviting you to consider is that it is broad and it is deep. And we have the opportunity every day in how we show up as individuals in the community to distangle, to um, slow down the machine, right? To take a step back and examine, how am I playing a role and what can I do differently? So I already talked about Herschel Walker. That was a mess in Georgia, and I'm so glad that Georgia was able to pull through for us as a country. But again, I think the same defense. It's interesting. Some of the defenses that I've been hearing for Watson have again been blaming victims, right? And I think we saw this with Herschel Walker. It's like where, like we're always looking for the women to come up with a reason, like, why were you in that situation, why did you put yourself there? Or the one that I heard recently was, well, these women didn't have their licenses, they were doing these massages and he was finding them on social media. Well, okay, right? It's like we are always looking for the victim to give a reason as to why she should not have or they should not have experienced gender violence. And then I think we can even talk about so much of the violence that has just occurred when I think about the Q nightclub shooting that just happened. Gender violence, that was a safe space for queer folks, non-gender conforming folks to be, to enjoy one another, and in their safe space, violence was brought upon them. So it's not just happening in Cleveland. Of course, we know it's happening across the country. There's so many examples. I could spend this whole session conversation giving the examples and the reasons why. But again, my invitation for you is just to really begin to think about, in what ways are you showing up and enabling the rhetoric, right? What are the conversations that you're hearing, whether it's among family or friends or in the workplace, that you are just allowing to happen, that you're giving a green light to? Or maybe you're in a position of leadership at your organization. What are the things that are happening that you're just like, you know what, I have to keep my head down, I have to worry about myself, I have to do my job? That is literally what the system, capitalism, all these things, it wants to keep us in silos. And y'all, that is why I'm so big on community. If you've never heard me talk about NOLA movement, the pillars of my business are movement, mindset, and community. And the reason why I believe community is so important is because when these things happen, first of all, you need folks to talk to, folks that you're in relationship with, folks that will believe you and trust you and support you and hold you and give you what you need, right? But community allows us to check in, even when there isn't anything wrong, right? Allows us to say, hey, what's going on where you're at? Hey, what's going on where you're at? Okay, do you need support, right? Do you need support? But we're able to really check in on one another and hold those that are in leadership accountable. So I'm huge on community. And, I think it's incredibly important right now, especially for a city like Cleveland. And again, for men, women, non-gender conforming folks that are listening to this, for you to find community that will support you, that will listen to you, that will love on you, that will believe you, that will uplift and affirm your unique experience as a human being. So, this is it, y'all. This is the conversation I wanted to have, and just some of the thoughts that I wanted to offer around this book and around bringing it into our real experience as humans living in America specifically, but we could talk about the globe more broadly, right, as it relates to gender violence. And so what's next? What's next? I would never want to have this conversation and not offer some love, some light, some energy, and some action steps. And so, again, throughout this, I've been offering an invitation. If you feel like you're someone that's listening to this and you have not been personally impacted by gender violence, I would invite you to really think about what ways are you upholding the norms of gender violence in our culture. So begin to be very sensitive with your ears. Begin to pay attention about the small talk that's happening and that you're engaging in and that you're allowing. Begin to pay attention what's happening at your workplace, right? When you're in a meeting, are women's voices spoken over? Are they pushed down? Are their ideas then taken and remixed and then called someone else's ideas, right? Begin to be very sensitive to what is happening. And again, I use women because that is the lean that I have, but I want to be very specific when I say gender violence is toward folks that are not conforming to gender roles. And so I'm using women, but that is the same for men. If there are men who are emotional or passionate, or some of the things that we would normally ascribe to women, and you notice that they're being treated a certain way for that, that is gender violence, right? So begin to pay attention to where around you, because I guarantee you, where around you are you seeing it? Because if you're not seeing it right now, it's because you're not paying attention. It's because you're not sensitive enough to the issue, and that means you get to do some work. And so I want you to really check out the comments, check out the notes that I'm leaving, because I'm leaving some resources here for you to consider. And so again, inviting those of you who are immediately impacted by gender violence, I invite you to find community. Find community where you will be loved, supported, held, and affirmed. If you are local to Cleveland, I want to offer some resources here, and I will link them in the comments. But I want to offer some resources for you to check out if you are able to get transportation there or find your way there. These are spaces that will support you, affirm you, and even some of them offer resources if you are needing and looking for a fresh start. Some of them I've mentioned. So the Renee Jones Empowerment Center, that is a space specifically for folks who are victims or being sex trafficked. So if you or anyone that you know is in that space right now, I invite you to reach out to the Renee Jones Empowerment Center, the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, NAMI of Greater Cleveland. That's also a national organization that you can connect with. If you're listening to this from any city, you can look up your local NAMI chapter. They offer support groups. And if you are recovering or just need support, that can be a space that you go to find other survivors. The LGBTQ Center of Greater Cleveland. A lot of these places are located right downtown or right off of downtown. West 25th is more or less the neighborhood for a lot of these centers, so they're easy to get to by public transportation. But the LGBTQ Center of Greater Cleveland, if you are a part of the queer community, that is such an affirming space. They offer so many resources. And again, the pillars of my business being movement, mindset, and community, that is a space that if you're part of that community, they check all three of those. So connect in there and find your people. Love Doesn't Shove. This is an organization that I mentioned. Gabby Cruz, she goes into schools and really begins to have the conversation with young people about creating healthy dating relationships. Because when we talk about this pipeline, when we talk about going from the cradle, from blue and pink to dating violence, and shoving little boys and girls and allowing the boys will be boys mentality, she really begins to speak into that from a perspective of young people. So love doesn't shove. If you're an organization or a school that has young people, that is a great place to begin to have the conversation appropriate for that age group. Bessie's Angels, if you are someone that is in foster care or aging out of foster care, this is an organization that is set up to support you. Oftentimes, that is a space where gender violence is experienced. So I want to make sure that I recognize you and I see you. Bessie's Angels. And then finally, I also shared the YWCA. If you are experiencing homelessness right now and you are a woman in the city of Cleveland, the YWCA does have a shelter, and so they will be able to support you. And so I will share all of those below. If you are hearing or listening to this, my intention and my prayer is that this supports you in whatever space you're in. Again, my name is Nike Olabisi-Green, and it is truly my heart to see women well from the inside out. And so I believe conversations like this are so important. And I wanted to have this one at a community level because Cleveland is a city and a place that is near and dear to my heart. And so if you're listening to this and you're in Cleveland, and you know that it would support someone or be insightful for someone, I invite you to share this. I invite you to like it. I invite you to comment. Let me know. And then, of course, if you are needing support, immediately 911. And then the National Suicide and Crisis Hotline is 988. So please continue to take care of yourself. Continue to take baby steps to love on yourself, be kind with yourself, and be gentle with yourself. I want to invite you to give yourself a lot of grace. Remember that we're living in a time and in a world that is really harsh. It's really tough. And so if you are breathing, if you can feel your feet flat on the ground, if you can wiggle your toes, you are loved and supported, and you're going to be okay. So again, my name is Nike Olabisi-Green. I'm the creator and chief movement leader at NOLA Movement, and I deeply believe that when women are well from the inside out, we can change the world. My prayer is that this conversation serves and supports you, and I'll be back next week. I'm actually thrilled. Next week, we are going to be revisiting the book Vibrate Higher Daily. And that book, I will have a guest on, Don Rivers, and we're going to be talking about the power of the unplug and the different ways to do that, including retreats and getaways. And I think so often we think that retreats have to be off in the woods, and that absolutely can be, but how do you create a retreat with yourself right where you're at? So thank you guys. I love you. Sending you so much love and light. I will see you next time.